Alright, so if you're stumbling across this video, you probably want to learn how to program. Now there's courses out there online that'll teach you all the basics of programming, but what I think they fail to tell you is that in all reality, programming just takes a lot of practice and a lot of work. You're not going to understand everything after the first video. There'll be courses out there that'll say, hey, I'll teach you Python in 10 minutes, I'll teach you JavaScript or how to program in 10 minutes. And that's really not the case. You might learn a thing or two, but really it's going to take time and it's going to take persistence. But what I'm going to do in this course is try to take you guys from zero to effective, right, in the world of programming. How am I going to do that? I believe that the best way to teach someone how to program is by building something real. Now, we could talk all day about variables, data types, flows, loops, functions, classes, but I don't think that's efficient. What I think I'm gonna do is I'm gonna build out an idea that I have in my head, which is to pull an image every day from NASA's servers and then send me an email so I can start to learn a little bit more about space. And I believe this is cool because it's going to teach you a lot about how we interact with other services, such as APIs. We're going to learn Python programming, which is a language that we can use to interact with the computer and write software. And then on top of that, we're going to learn how to solve a problem, right? Most of the time, why people learn to program and learn to code is because they have a business idea in their head, or they have this cool app idea and they don't know where to get started. I'm going to break all that down, and we're going to talk about what it means to be successful with programming and really how to build something. Now, one thing I do want to stress is that I am not an expert engineer. I've not been working in the field for 15 to 20 years. I've actually only really been programming for about 6 to 7. Now, I do work in the industry professionally, and I have written code for customers and in production environments. Now, with that being said, I'm not the guy you're going to want to go to if you're going to say, what is the most efficient and optimal way to write code in every scenario? I know a thing or two, but I don't know everything. And that's really what programming, I believe, is all about. It's a journey. We're all continuing to learn every day, and the best way we can approach it is by being curious and really asking people that are smarter than us how they approach problems and how they solve these issues that we run into while programming. So with that being said, let's jump right into the course and start learning. Alright, so as I mentioned, we are going to be building an app that takes data from NASA's server and then emails that to us. Now, what we're going to be doing specifically is pulling an astronomy picture of the day from NASA's servers. So what NASA servers are built on is what's called a RESTful API. Now, REST API allows us to complete a transaction between two computers. Essentially, look at it this way. If I was to make a transaction with you and you were a business owner, right? We are exchanging money for goods. Essentially what we're doing with the computer is we're making a request out to the server, which is just a computer, and they're giving us something back in return. In this case, we're going to be reaching out and saying, give me a picture of the day in the description along with it, and NASA's going to say, sure, here you go, right? So that's essentially what a transaction or a RESTful API does. Now, how it does that is via HTTP. This stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And why we need to do this is because it allows us to actually send that request out to NASA servers. The most common ways to do this are through get, post, put, and delete. These are 4 common methods that are used. In today's tutorial, we're going to be using get and post. So, as I mentioned, once we have this data, what do we do with it? As I mentioned, we want to send this to our email on a daily basis. So what we're going to be doing is using Mailjet, which is an email service, to send that data to our email. Now, you could set up your own SMTP server, which allows you to forward emails, but I don't suggest you do that. It's easier to just use a service like Mailjet. Awesome. So the first thing we're going to do is install Python itself. You can do this from python.org by going into Downloads and clicking on Download Python and unzipping the package. If you're on Windows or Linux, you can do this as well. However, since I'm on Mac, I'm going to use something called Homebrew, which allows me to install it through a package manager. To install Homebrew, I'm just going to have to add this to my clipboard and run the command, and this will install. It'll take a moment, so don't worry about it. You might have to enter in your computer's password as well. So once that is installed, you can run brew version, or I believe it is brew -- version, and it'll tell you which version of Homebrew you're on. Now, the next thing we're going to have to do is install a text editor real quick. So I prefer using Sublime Text. Sublime Text is a great tool to be able to write Python code. It's essentially just a way of modifying text. It's nothing too fancy. But it's better than using your terminal and using Vim, especially if you don't know that. It's super overwhelming. So don't worry about using Vim. We're going to use Sublime Text. Okay, awesome. So now let's set up the scaffolding for our project. Now in the terminal, which can be found in the top right-hand corner, or by typing in terminal, we're going to set up our project directory. Now we're going to run mkdir nasa.app, and this will create a directory. So then when I run ls, you're going to see that I have this NASA app that I can cd into. And then when I run ls, I have an app.py and a vn file. Now what do these actually do? So our app.py is where we're going to be writing our script. So to do that, just do touch app.py, and this will create that file. And then for our Python virtual environment, this is a way that we can isolate dependencies. So what pip allows us to do, and that's what we get when installing Python, it's essentially Python's package manager. So if we want to write code and not do it from scratch, pip is a great way, or a great tool. People in the community, in the Python community, have already written code that we can reuse. We don't have to write it ourselves. So like I mentioned, we're going to be reaching out to NASA servers to get an image of the day. And we probably don't want to rewrite that code to be able to make a network request. So there's packages out there that already do that for us. So if you run pip -- version, you should get something along the lines of 24.0 and 3.11 for your Python version. Now if you run pip list, you might have a lot of packages installed. In my case, I do because I've been using pip for some time. But let's just install the virtual environment library that we need. So by running pip install virtual env, we now have that installed. And in our NASA app, we can do python 3 -m venv. When we run this, it's going to create a virtual environment. So when we do ls, we're going to get our venv. Now, we want to isolate our dependencies to the NASA app. So what we're going to do is we're going to source into our virtual environment by doing source venv bin activate. You can see on the left-hand side that there has been a virtual environment instantiated. So now when we run pip list, you're going to see that we don't get as many as before. And that's because I only scoped it to this project. So why do I have these to begin with? Now if we look at our app.py file, you can see I already imported a few: JSON, OS, requests, load.env, and then mailjet rest. So you can see that I commented these and told you what they do. So this, for one, allows us to make an API request, meaning reach out to NASA servers and also send to mailjet, right? And then from .env, this is going to load a env file. Why we want an env file is because let's say someone gets a hold of your code and you're defining your API keys, which we'll talk about in your code. That's a security risk. And you don't want other people to have your secret keys to access things. So we're going to need a .env file, and then mailjet rest is another package that allows us to communicate with mailjet service. Remember how we're going to send emails. So what I did is went to mailjet rest and ran pip install mailjet rest. So let's do that real quick. Awesome, so we have mailjet rest. Now let's install requests, which we need for the API requests. And then we're going to need pip install python.env. So once we have that, now we have all of our packages needed. In Sublime, OS and JSON are automatically out of the box, so we don't have to worry about that. So we have step one complete. We have the packages we need to write our application. This was only 6 lines, right? Now let's get to step 2, which is pulling the data from NASA's APIs. So we're going to say request data from NASA API. So I like to think about things in steps, or in almost like recipes. And in step 2, we're going to say request data from NASA API. Now I want to declare a function. A function in Python essentially allows us to reuse or recycle code. So let's say I wanted to make an API request to NASA here, but then maybe somewhere else in another application I want to do that same thing. I'm not going to want to rewrite all the code that I did to make this API request. I'm going to want to just reuse it, almost like a plug and play option. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function which allows us to reuse this. So I'm going to call this def, and then I'm going to say get picture from NASA, right? And I can pass parameters in here, and these are optional. I don't have to pass any parameters. And then I'm going to use this colon. I'll explain what parameters do momentarily, but then I'm going to click space, and you're going to see that when I tab in, Python relies on what's called indentation. Now, you can see that I named this function getPictureFromNASA with underscores in lower cases. This is called snake case, and it's a best practice in Python. So what we're going to want to do is use this convention moving forward, especially when defining variables. So instead of saying something like hello world with camel case, we're going to want to say hello underscore world. Cool. So let's first get an API key from NASA's API. So what we do is we're going to navigate to api.nasa.gov, and we're going to say get started. This will have us enter in our email, and it will send us an API key. Now we can browse our API keys. So these are all the APIs we're going to be that are accessible to us, but we're only going to be using the APOD astronomy picture of the day. So as I mentioned, you probably got something in your inbox with an API key. So we're going to want to create a .env file to store this. We can run touch.env, and now you're going to see that when we click on this in Sublime, we have our tokens here. I already pasted my NASA API token that was sent to me, so it's going to be NASA underscore API underscore token, like the snake case convention I mentioned, equals blah. And then we're going to also set up Mailjet. So we're going to go into mailjet.com, and then we're just going to click Get Started. And what this will do, I'll run through the process, and I'm going to log in real quick, is it's going to give us an API key as well. If you click on API once you're in Mailjet, you're going to see that there's a primary API key with a main account token and a secret key. We're going to want to copy these and store them as variables in our .env because it's what we're going to use to actually communicate with their client to send this email out. Right, awesome. So what we're going to do is we're going to start writing our function to actually capture this data. Well, the first thing we're going to need is the URL. So if we go to NASA's open APIs and we look at the HTTP request to get this image, we're going to have to run a get on api.nasa.gov planetary apod. So we'll do first URL, and then we'll define our URL here. And then we'll say request.get URL. So essentially what we're doing here is we're using the request library to make a GET request to our URL. And that is this HTTP. Remember I said we use HTTP or HTTPS, which is secure, to make a request to NASA servers. So now let's run this and see what happens. We do this by running Python 3 in the name of our file, and you're going to see nothing gets returned. So we don't actually know if this worked or not. So what we want to do is declare a variable response equals request.get.url. So now, when I print my response, you're going to see I get nothing yet again. And that's because with functions in Python, we need to actually call them. This is a declaration. Now we need to actually call that function to make it work. So we're going to call getPictureFromNASA with the parentheses. And you're going to see we get a 403. Now 403s are usually not good, so we got to understand why we're getting that 403 code. So let's do response.text, which will give us back the text of our response. And you're going to see API key missing. No API key was supplied. Well, that's weird because in our .env file, we actually declared this NASA API token, so why isn't it using it? Well, first, we need to actually load in our .env file, which is by calling this function load_.env, and this is going to pull in our env. Now the next thing we're going to need is to declare a new variable that pulls it in from our env file, specifically the NASA API token. So we're going to say NASA underscore API underscore token, but use capitals. It's still snake case, but we're using all caps, and I'll explain why. And then we're going to say OS, which is operating system, get an environment variable from our .env file in the NASA API token specifically, which is in parentheses. So now, what if we want to use this, right? Well, if we look back at the documentation and we scroll down, it's going to say, here's an example query, right? Here is our api.nasa.gov, but then there's also a query parameter, which is just what we can enter into the URL. But we need to pass the API key through the query parameter. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass what's called a token or a parameter into our function. And we're going to say, and API key equals, well, this case says demo key, but we want it to be our NASA API token. So I'm going to put that in. So let's run this again. Okay, get picture from NASA, missing one required positional argument token. So why is that happening? Because when we call this function, remember, we need to pass in our token. So what we want to do is pass in the NASA API token as an argument or a parameter. So now when we run this, you can still see that we get API key invalid and invalid API key was supplied. But why is it saying that? We passed in our NASA API token. Well, we're not actually saying that we're going to use a variable in this string. What we need to do is use what's called a formatted string that allows us to pass the variable token in here. So now if we look at what's happening here and we walk through a debugging process top to bottom, we're saying, okay, define the function get picture from NASA. And then we're declaring it or calling it and saying pass through this NASA API token that we got from our .env file. So we're pulling this in, we're declaring it in a variable, we're then calling the function, but passing it in as a token, which is this just a name for this variable, and then we're calling it in our URL. So now when we run this, we now get the proper response back. Awesome. So that means that we authenticated ourselves when making a request out to NASA servers. They say, okay, this is Sean. We're going to let him through, get whatever data he wants from this URL. Cool. So now that we have that, we need to get what's really important to us, right? We need to get the picture. And if we look at this JSON blob, and if you're wondering what JSON is, I totally recommend reading up on it. I'm not going to break it down too much in this video, but JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And if you want to know what JavaScript really is, you can watch a ton of videos on it. It's extremely good skill to know, and I definitely recommend doing some research on it. But essentially, this is what JSON is, right? It's just a key value pair. And you can see that we have this URL that's returned to us at the bottom of this JSON. And if we go into Chrome and actually enter in that URL, you can see we have a picture of almost what looks like the solar eclipse, which is pretty cool. I don't know much about space, which is what I'm trying to learn. So you can see here that it's either some sort of eclipse or moon cycle. Now, I want to get this URL programmatically. So how do I do that? Well, let's say I want to access something in JSON. What I can do is say this variable response and then define our key. So our key here is URL. Real quick, just in case you're wondering what that means, let's say I have a variable called person. And in here, I have an object or JSON. And I have a key name, and this is Sean. And I have age is 25. Now, if I want to access Sean, all I have to do is person, name, which is my key, and it will give me back Sean. So in my case, I have my response object, but all I want is the URL. So give me this URL. And we'll store this in a variable called image URL. So let's run this. Okay, we get a type error. It says response object is not subscriptable. So it's pretty much saying, I understand this is JSON, but it's not really defined as a type of JSON. Now, how do I know that? By doing what's called the type function. So if I print out type, and then I say type of response, and I run this, you're going to see that it returns a class, request.models.response. Well, this isn't exactly JSON, right? This is its own thing. So we need to convert this to JSON. How do I do that? Easiest way, just append .json to my request. So I'm saying go get the data from this URL and then format it as JSON. So now when I run image URL and I print out the image URL, I get my proper URL that brings up my picture. Great, right? So now I know that I can return this in my function. So let's do return image URL. So now that I have this, what I'm essentially doing is I am calling my function getPictureFromNASA, passing through my API token, we're doing a GET request, formatting it into JSON, and then getting the URL image and returning it. So when I call this function, I want to pass this variable, or I want to store it in a variable called image URL. This means that whatever's returned is going to be stored in this variable after calling this function. So now if I print image URL, you're going to see that I still get the URL back. See? So now what I want to do is I want to complete step 3, which is to send this to my email. Send to my email. Now let's define a new function, and let's call this def send email. And we won't use any parameters at the moment. So how do we actually use this function? Well, the first thing we're going to want to do is authenticate ourselves to Mailjet, right? They need to know who we are so we can start sending emails. So if we go into the pip documentation at pypi.org, and you know that we installed Mailjet REST, what we're going to do is scroll down, and we're going to define this variable here, which is Mailjet equals client auth API key API secret. So what I'm going to want to do is pop that in my function nested below with a tab. But I see that I have API key and API secret. So I don't know what these are, right? They probably want me to put in my data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to declare 2 more variables. I'm going to call this Mailjet API token, and we're going to say os.getEnv. And then if you remember in our .env file, we did Mailjet API token. And then we're going to say Mailjet session key. And that's going to say os.getEnv Mailjet secret key. So now we have our secret key and our API token. We're going to have to change these API keys to Mailjet API token, Mailjet session key. So now let's print Mailjet. Awesome, nothing happens though. Aha, because I have to call my function, remember. So if I now run send email outside of the function, you're going to see that I get this back. And this essentially says that I'm returning the client object, which isn't really useful to us, right? But it proves that this is working as expected. So let's move on. The next thing we have to do is define our template for our email. So you can see if we scroll below, it says make your first call. Here's an example on how to send an email. So let's grab this body, which is our data, and let's pop it in to our send email function. We're going to have to tab this in, and you're going to see data equals an object, or JSON, right? So we're passing JSON, and it's saying messages in a list, define our from, which is our sender email, and in this case we're going to do Sean P. Pitts, which is my personal email, .com. Now I thought I wanted this to be the to, not the sender. So I don't want this to be from Sean, I want this to go to Sean. Well, in Mailjet, if you go into your account, and go to account settings, you can see you can actually define or add a domain or sender address. And I define Sean Pitts below, Sean P. Pitts as a sender. So I'm going to send it from myself and receive it to myself. So I'm going to say me, and then my recipient email, or the to, is going to be seanpitts@gmail.com. And it's going to be Sean. So my subject in the email, just like you receive an email from anyone, is going to be picture from NASA. and it's going to say greetings from NASA. Now you'll see that the HTML part is actually going to give me what's called tags. Now if you look at HTML tags, and we can do that by saying HTML images, you're going to see that there's something called an image tag. And this is what we're going to want to pass to return our image or send it to us. So let's delete everything in this string. And let's just start with an empty one. We're going to say image, which is *img, source equals double brackets, or double quotes, and then define. So now we're going to pass in our variable, right? So we want to get our image URL and pass it through into our function. So we're going to do it like this. Now let's send this email, or let's run this. Okay, invalid syntax. Perhaps you forgot a comma? Well, not really. We didn't forget a comma. What happened is we tried to use double quotes wrapped in double quotes. So it's saying, here's a string, but it ends here. So I don't know what this is because it's not wrapped in a string. So what we have to do is we have to switch this to be single quotes. Cool. So we have our source of image URL, which is that JPEG file that it gave me. But if I run this now, it's going to run, but I don't think it actually sent me my image URL. And the reason being is because I need to use a formatted string. So if I want to declare a variable, remember I did in the URL, I need to use a formatted string. So let's run it like this. Awesome, that worked. Cool. So now that we know this is working, we need to actually handle what's called scope. So as I mentioned before, one thing we're doing is defining these variables in all uppercase. Now NASA _API _token, what we're doing here is we're saying, let's declare a global variable. What a global variable means is it's not scoped or tied to a function. So let's say I do get picture from NASA and I say name equals Sean. And then outside of my function, I try to print that. And this is defined by the the tabbing, right? So if I collapse this and I collapse my functions, you're going to see I'm outside of my function. So let's print name. Name error. Name is not defined. Why is that? Because I'm in the scope of my function. Now if I try to call it outside of my function, it's going to yell at me. It's going to say, I don't know what name is, because you defined it in your function, not outside it. Global variables work in the opposite. Global variables can be used anywhere in the script, right? So if you want to use it in the function, like NASA API token, you could use this in the function, right? But there's a problem with that. The problem being you don't want to use global functions most of the time, because what happens is, let's say you have another script and you're calling functions from multiple scripts and the global variable updates somewhere and then you're calling it somewhere else. You can run into conflicts and then you don't really know what's going on, and that can be a huge headache. So you want to usually keep variables to what's called local, or the scope of the function. So now let's do this. Let's pass our image URL to our function. And what we're doing here is we're now saying image is our parameter. Image is what we're going to be using in our data. And the image URL is going to get passed in our send email function. So we're passing the image URL that we get back from the get picture from NASA, and then passing it into our send email function, which also calls it in the HTML part. So the last thing we're going to want to do now is send our email. So if we go back into Mailjet REST and we do result equals mailjet.send.create. So let's paste that in here. Now we see that it's calling this data object. It's saying send.create expects data, and we are passing it data. Now we could change this to email template if we wanted to. So it's a different variable name, and pass this in data. So now when we print result, let's see what we get. Okay, so we get a 400 code. Now let's try to understand what that is. Remember, if we use the .text function, it's going to give us more details. In this case, we don't get anything. So why are we getting a 400? So if we look at the function here, I can see that the client is declared and we are instantiating this client class. However, if I look at my Mailjet REST API, you can see that there is a version that's declared that I didn't add. So maybe that's why our 400 is being thrown. So let's, after this mailjet session key, let's go version equals version 3.1. So now that we declared that, now let's try to rerun this. Oh, okay, awesome. So we get a 200 code. So that's good. That means successful in the world of HTTP. So let's go to our email and let's see if this came in. Awesome. So we can see now that by running this script, it pulled data from NASA's API servers and sent them to our email. But like I said, we want to add description as well. So let's go back and add that. So I talked about that the image URL is one thing we can return, but the explanation is something we also can return. So let's go explanation equals response. And this is where we're getting the picture from NASA. So if you remember our URL body, which was JSON, it was explanation. So now, instead of returning just the image URL, let's also return the explanation. So what we're going to do when we get that picture is return the image URL, and then in our variable where we call the function, we're also going to have to pass explanation. And we can even call this image explanation. So let's make this some more convention, image URL, image explanation. But now we have to add another parameter, because if we're going to use this in our send email function, we need to add the explanation as well. And this can be whatever we want it to, but as long as we pass in the correct parameter in our send email call. So now we're going to put in image explanation, which is what we return. And now in our send email function, we have access to this explanation. So what we're going to do is do a break, and this is going to create a new line in HTML, and then we're going to make a paragraph tag. And we're going to open it and close it by doing this, which is greater than, p less than, or it's actually less than, p greater than, and the same thing. And that's how we close it out, but we use a backslash. So then let's reference this variable explanation, and let's run it again. Okay, name response is not defined. Did you mean response? So where did I do that? Oh, I called it responds and not response on line 20. So now, let's run it. We get a 200 again. Now let's see if we got a new email. Looks like we did. Looks safe. Aha, look at this. We get a paragraph that says, will the sky be clear enough to see the eclipse? This question is already on the minds of many North Americans hoping to see tomorrow's solar eclipse. If you don't know, Monday, April 8th, we're supposed to get a solar eclipse. So this is actually pretty cool. What this is showing, it seems like, it says then the total darkness shot across the mainland of the USA from coast to coast from Oregon to South Carolina. But like tomorrow's event, a partial eclipse occurred above most of North America. In 2017, we also got one of these. Me and my dad actually climbed the mountain and actually looked up at it. It was pretty underwhelming, so hopefully this year is better. But you can see now that we've built an app. We pulled data using Python from NASA's API servers and sent an email to our Gmail account. And this is just one example of an application. We could then make this a website. We could do some crazy stuff with this. And honestly, I'm probably going to build out more tutorials on web applications and how to build apps. So if you guys really like this video and you got a lot of use out of this course, please like and subscribe in this channel. Also, leave a comment below and just let me know what you guys would like to explore in the future. Now, you'll notice that there is one thing I did not build, which I said I would, and that is to send this every 24 hours or send to my email at a certain time. Now, the reason I didn't do that was actually strategic. I want you guys to go build it. I've kind of give you some skills in this video to be able to run with this. So if you want to try to send this to you at a specific time, go ahead, build on it, and just continue to learn. So thank you guys so much for tuning into this video, this course, this series, whatever you want to call it. And I will see you guys in the next video. Take care.